December 20th, 1998, the 30th anniversary of the Zodiac mystery. I found myself in a motel room just a few miles from the Zodiac's first crime scene, which was out on lonely Lake Herman Road. An overheard conversation that morning led me to a remote spot in the hills high above that Zodiac murder scene, to a location that was long rumored to be the Zodiac's hideout, known to locals as the Zodiac Shack. By early afternoon that day, I was crossing the Bay Bridge to actually meet the legendary San Francisco detective who famously searched in vain for the Zodiac. And that day ended with me alone in the dark out on Lake Herman Road, in the exact spot of the Zodiac's murders, completely terrified by the most unexpected encounter. The 30th anniversary of the Zodiac mystery was the most memorable day I've had so far in all of my years chasing the Zodiac. And with the 50th anniversary just around the corner, I feel this is a story worth telling in my murder basement. At motels in small-town Benicia, California, continental breakfasts consist of instant coffee and a bear claw fresh from the vending machine. I call it the Zodiac diet. And it was during my breakfast that I overheard voices around the corner discussing the Zodiac killer. A group of people were at the front desk. It turned out the local newspaper had published a 30th anniversary story about the Zodiac case. Now, today in 2018, the case is part of pop culture. But back then, if you displayed a public interest in the Zodiac, you might notice others around you slowly backing away. So I kept my mouth shut until I heard someone mention a place called the Zodiac Shack. I'd never heard of it, and I actually thought the Zodiac Shack might be the name of a dive bar. My favorite dive bar at the time was in Vallejo, an old dump called Dinky Doos. I first went to Dinky Doos months earlier with a retired Vallejo cop named Steve Baldino. We were searching for Zodiac victim Mike Mageau, who decades earlier had been wounded as Zodiac went on to kill his friend Darlene Ferrin. Allegedly, Mageau had returned to Vallejo after years of hiding out of state and would occasionally frequent Dinky Doos, or at least that was what our informant had told us. I showed the bartender a photo of Mageau, but no luck. We never found him, and soon after, Dinky Doos closed for good and was eventually torn down. So I was in the market for a new Vallejo area watering hole, but at the front desk I was told the Zodiac Shack was not a dive bar, rather an abandoned homestead off of Sky Valley Road, which connected to Lake Herman Road. Nobody had lived there since the 1940s, and it had been rumored for decades the Zodiac killer had used the shack as a hideout. None of the people at the front desk had actually been to the shack, but I was still able to get directions. In the motel parking lot, ready to head out, I called Pam Huckabee. Pam is the sister of Zodiac victim Darlene Ferrin and was living in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. Pam had generously let me borrow her cell phone. I was surprised to learn that Pam had heard of the Zodiac Shack. She didn't know where it was. When I told her I was headed there, Pam asked me if I had a gun. I told Pam I didn't have a gun, but that I'd call her as soon as I got there, so she'd know I was okay. Driving down Lake Herman Road, I passed the Zodiac's crime scene to my left. It was deserted, as was the rest of the area. No cars or people in sight, just rolling hills and trees and cows. I made a right turn onto Sky Valley Road, which was really just a glorified gravel driveway, narrow and steep in places and looking like it hadn't been traveled in a very long time. I had been told back at the motel the shack would be on the left, just past the Borges Ranch. Back on the night of December 20th, 1968, Stella Borges had found the Zodiac's first victims, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, in a turnout just off Lake Herman Road. 3 decades later, The Borges Ranch was still operational, so I knew I was close to the shack. I parked my car and looked around. Eventually, I spotted an old rickety bridge that appeared to lead to the right area. The bridge was mostly hidden by overgrown trees and brush, and obviously hadn't been used in decades. I pressed on, and the bridge led me to the spookiest gate I had ever seen. At that point, I remembered I was supposed to call Pam Huckabee, which I tried to do, but there was zero cell reception. No way to make a call, and nobody even knew I was there except for Pam, who didn't know where the shack was. And of course, no gun. Thankfully, the area beyond that spooky gate was wide open with good visibility. I was completely isolated. I could see an old barn and a tiny farmhouse, which I knew was the Zodiac Shack. So there was no way I could turn back now, even though I was feeling quite vulnerable. First, I reached the barn. It swayed with the wind, and I couldn't figure out how it was still standing. I entered the barn briefly to take some photos. I moved on to that tiny farmhouse, the Zodiac Shack. It was terrifying. There was just a bad vibe about it that I can't put into words, and I can completely understand why the locals were morbidly fascinated by it, at least those few locals who had actually made the trek to the Zodiac Shack. Aside from a few cross circle symbols, which could have been left there by anybody, I found no reason to believe the homestead was ever used by the Zodiac killer. In fact, I think the Zodiac would have been just as creeped out by the place as I was. The photos I took documenting the Zodiac Shack were quickly added to zodiackiller.com and can be viewed to this day. However, all of the structures on the property have since been destroyed, curiously burned to the ground not long after my visit. Leaving the area of the Zodiac Shack, I had to remind myself not to speed.
A key figure in the Zodiac investigation is Detective Dave Toski. Toshi isn't shy about publicity, but he's also a seasoned cop who's determined to get his man.
Within the hour, I was crossing the Bay Bridge, heading into downtown San Francisco. Halfway across the bridge, I noticed it was snowing. Snow seemed unusual for San Francisco, but I wasn't certain. Just then, Pam's cell phone rang. It was Pam, asking where I was and if I could see the snow. It turns out, in all of the years Pam had lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, it had never snowed, not even once. And it was such an unusual event that CNN was reporting about it live on TV. That's how Pam knew it was snowing in San Francisco. So I felt like this might be my lucky day. And I was heading to the Pan Pacific Hotel in downtown San Francisco to try and talk with its head of security, former Zodiac super cop, Dave Toski, who was portrayed by actor Mark Ruffalo in the 2007 film called Zodiac. Toski was notoriously elusive since his retirement from SFPD and almost never discussed the Zodiac case. Plus, I knew that to people of Toski's generation, the internet was not necessarily a good thing. I figured Toski had probably heard of my website, zodiackiller.com, but I had my doubts that Toski would talk to me. Toski approached me, and as soon as I mentioned Zodiac, the first thing he said to me was that he had awoken that morning with his first thought that it was the 30th anniversary of the Zodiac double murder out at Lake Herman Road. What a great moment that was. It was so nice to know that it isn't just us amateur detectives who care about such things as anniversaries. The super cops also care. Toski let me talk his ear off for a while. He couldn't answer most of my questions, which were mostly about Zodiac suspect Arthur Lee Allen. As Toski's an old-school cop, even in retirement, and the Zodiac case is, after all, an open homicide investigation. Toski did tell me that he was impressed with my website, zodiackiller.com, and he signed a photo I had brought with me, a photo of Toski taken in October 1969, shortly after the Zodiac killer had murdered his San Francisco victim, Paul Stein. On the photo, Toski also wrote the date, as well as Merry Christmas. And after getting to meet Dave Toski, it was indeed shaping up to be a Merry Christmas. But first, I had to survive the night of the 30th anniversary, alone, out at the Zodiac's Lake Herman Road crime scene, below the horrifying Zodiac Shack. The snow stopped not long after I left Dave Toski and the Pan Pacific Hotel. And very soon, it would be feeling much more like Halloween than like Christmas.
On December 20th, 1968, a teenage couple stop in a secluded lover's lane in the Northern California community of Vallejo. Both end up victims of a killer with a 9mm handgun.
I was emotionally drained when I got back at my motel room in Benicia, and I knew that if I wanted to be at the Zodiac's Lake Herman Road crime scene late that night, at the exact time of the attack, I'd need to take a nap first. And that's what I tried to do, but not without nightmares. I was actually relieved when it was time to wake up. I got myself caffeinated and headed out to Lake Herman Road. It was well after 10 p.m., and I didn't see any other cars on my way to the crime scene. Once at the gravel turnout, I parked in the approximate spot where David and Betty's car was found so many years earlier. It was pitch black outside, but I decided to at least attempt to take some photographs. The trees around me were apparently frozen, making spooky sounds every time the wind blew. I knew that criminals sometimes returned to the scenes of their crimes, and I tried very hard not to think about how Zodiac himself could have been 10 feet in front of me, and I wouldn't have been able to see him in the dark. I wanted to photograph a wide shot of the entire turnout area, so I carefully backed up as far as I could on foot, backing across Lake Herman Road. Eventually, I found myself stopped by something large and solid, what I assumed was a fence post. That was as far as I could go. I couldn't back up anymore, so I took the picture. The flash went off, and I jumped all the way back across Lake Herman Road. What I thought was a large fence post was actually an enormous cow. It was so very dark out there that I didn't even see it. Apparently, the flash of my camera had spooked it. Had the Zodiac indeed been watching me that night, he probably would have gotten a good laugh out of what happened. And that ended an epic day, the 30th anniversary of the Zodiac mystery.
He called himself the Zodiac.
And we are fast approaching the 50th anniversary, coming up on December 20th, 2018. But you won't find me out on Lake Herman Road that night, and you shouldn't be out there either. I'll let Mr. Johnson explain why.
Hey, Tom Boy, you guys can't stop him. You can't cover him up. I will continue. I will never stop. You will never silence me.
Since the beginning, the Zodiac case has been plagued by people with bad brains. And I'm not sure which ones are crazier, some of the Zodiac suspects or some of the so-called helpful citizens who are sure they know the Zodiac's real identity and are convinced there is some kind of a conspiracy among the rest of us to keep them from being heard. What I know for certain is that Mr. Johnson is currently out of the mental hospital, somewhere in the San Francisco Bay Area, ranting and raving. And in his email and voicemail to me, threatening violence to those visiting the Zodiac's crime scene on Lake Herman Road outside Vallejo, California. Mr. Johnson is delusional and is convinced all other people are protecting the Zodiac killer. Some people make threats, but some people pose threats. And there is an important distinction. I believe Mr. Johnson poses a threat, and his psychiatrist agrees. And while the FBI is now involved, first they have to find him. The 50th anniversary of the Zodiac mystery is on December 20th, 2018. And I strongly encourage everyone to stay away from the Lake Herman area. Because if you don't, one day I might be telling your story in my murder basement.
In psychotherapy, it's important to be able to get the patient to talk, particularly to talk about his feelings and the events relevant to his problems.
Today's new hospital buildings center on human needs and comfort. The majority come by court order, committed either by a judge or a six-man jury. This was the case with Fred Clanton.
How are you, Fred?
Well, I'd be all right if they just left me alone.
Why don't you tell me about it?
You can't fool me. I know you're in with them, too.
Fred, I'm going to send you to the hospital.
He gets a blood test, part of the medical examination given each patient on admission. Escorted to the receiving ward by an attendant, he's bathed and outfitted. A cigarette from the doctor, and Fred's hand is steady. It's not too long till the psychiatrist decides that Fred can try it for a while at home. He talks with Betty and with George, helps them to understand that they too have vital roles to play in aiding Fred to adjust successfully to the world outside.
So this is it. Today I'm going home. 6 months it's taken. How much I hated George. How wrong I was. Or no, not wrong, sick. And now that I'm well again, I can't help feeling just a little sad.
I've got a couple of pretty important things I'm going to tell you. You've heard your mothers and fathers talking about things that happen to other little boys and girls, haven't you? Remember the story about the little girl in the paper? Hello, little lady. All alone, aren't you? I'll buy you some ice cream. Well, nobody ever saw her again. And what kind of a kid would a man like that look for? Jimmy here. Well, that's all right. Most everybody likes kids. Watch. Hello, Sally. I'm a friend of your mother's. She sent me to bring you home. Come on. Well, we've seen some dumb bunnies so far, haven't we? Well, gang, what have we learned from all this? Maybe Dodo here can show us. Sure, her parents tell her not to, but Miss Dodo thinks she's smart. A dodo is an extinct bird. That means it isn't alive anymore. That's the way this dodo's going to be extinct. Well, kids, I'll be seeing you.